So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Corina du Toit. I'm the Program Manager here at the African Doctoral Academy. Welcome to our fourth webinar that we've started having on Wednesdays. This time we'll be with Doris Viljoen, who's at the Insitute of Futurist Research. She's going to be doing a talk for us on creating scenarios, a brief introduction. She will be joined by her colleague Heilet Bertrand, who is the Sales and Marketing Manager at the Insitute for Futurist Research. And I'm being assisted by my colleague Ms who many of you might know from our schools. So, good. Ms, I think you've got everything under control. So I would like to say welcome to everybody, to our former 88 delegates and presenters, colleagues at Stellenbosch University. We will be recording this presentation and posting it on our YouTube channel, and we will share this with you via email if you also would like to share it with your colleagues. So Doris Viljoen, who is our presenter today, is a senior futurist at Stellenbosch University's Insitute for Futurist Research, where she endeavors to interpret global as well as local trends and assess their relevance for South Africa and Africa. She has specialized skills in environmental scanning, the application of foresight methodology, scenario planning, as well as strategy development. Before joining the IFR, or the Insitute for Futurist Research, Doris did consulting work on feasibility and location assessment studies for large capital projects and received the top student award for the MPhil in Future Studies program. So you're all in very, very good hands. She has a wide range of research interests and is passionate about asking the right questions, searching for and finding relevant data, as well as designing tools and techniques to facilitate thinking about plausible futures. So Doris first joined us at the ADA Summer School in January 2020, when she presented a course on applying scenario planning as a research method and thinking tool with her colleague, Dr. Mwagiru. So just the run through for today, we'll be doing the presentation session from 12 to 1, and then that will be followed by 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A, which Ms. Bertrand will handle. So with that, enough from me. Doris, over to you. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. And thanks for using your lunch hour to come and listen a little bit to what scenarios thinking is, how we do scenarios and anything like that. To just do a little bit of warm up, let us participate in the chat and think about 20 years into the future. It's 2021 now. Think about 2041 and tell us what you think in 2041 the people of the earth will be having for breakfast. Hopefully you are still around in 2041. Remember, all of us are scheduled or proposed or projected to become a lot older than what we have recently become as a population, as the people. So think about 2041 and let us participate in the chat and give each other a good thinking about what we will be having for breakfast in 2041. And then Amalsha, if you could stop sharing, then I can start sharing from my side. In case you were wondering, the slide pack will be available. If you would like to have it, we will be able to share that with you as well. Cool, so I'm going to start sharing slides. Corina said she still will be having coffees and stuff like that. Let's hope that that is still one of the things that is available to us by then. Cool. So, a brief overview of scenario planning. Obviously, when people hear that we work at the Insitute for Futurist Research, then one of the most frequent comments are, oh, you're the people from the scenarios. And yes, you know what? We use multiple tools and very many of those to help people to imagine multiple plausible futures, but scenario planning is one of the best known ones, and therefore the need for just sharing a little bit of that with you. But we cannot say a lot about scenario planning without just taking a step back and saying something about futures thinking. You will hear that I'm using the plural when we talk about futures, and there is a very good reason for that, because the whole futures thinking, the method of inquiry, stands on 3 assumptions. And the first one is, there is, wherever we stand in the present, there is always a range of plausible futures, the multiple. So there's not just one thing that's definitely going to happen. Wherever we stand in the present, we could imagine multiple different ways in which the future could play out. But seeds of those different futures already exist in the present. So we can research and try to understand and then make decisions, because based on our actions, the things that we choose to do or not to do, certain seeds will grow and other seeds will not grow into the future that happens. So wherever we stand, there's a range of plausible futures. Seeds of those different futures already exist in the present, and people have some influence about the future, over the future that eventually plays out. We co-create the future. And because of that, scenario planning and thinking about the longer future is so incredibly important. The very next question you may have is, okay, so are you the guys that predict the future? No, not at all. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't predict the future. What we try to do is to propose multiple plausible futures for one reason only, so that people, stakeholders in the process, could spend a little bit of mental rehearsal time in each of those different futures. And then based on what they've learned, the insights that they've gained from that mental rehearsal, they are then able to make better decisions today and tomorrow. So helping people to make better decisions, that is what we try to do. We don't try to predict the future. As leaders, wherever we are, our job is to enable a journey to help the people that are involved in whatever we are doing to move from sensing what is going on to making sense so that we can make change. So no matter what faculty you are working in, no matter what organization you are working in, this is our continuous job, sensing what is going on, making sense so that we can, from the insights from our sense-making processes, start making change. And as in that story, scenario planning plays a huge role in terms of helping people to make sense so that they can make the changes that is necessary. So, futures problems, can we or should we apply futures thinking to anything? You know what? Resources are always constrained. So there are some problems and issues that is easier and need other approaches. If we stack issues and problems along a continuum, we get the simple problems or issues. A known or a knowable problem where something like a light bulb that fused. It's easy to know what to do. You can have a standard operating procedure, boom, just fix it. Now those problems, you know what, it's okay. Then we have a little bit more complicated problems where there's many parts, but if you just apply expertise, and you make sure that everybody does their little thing. I put the picture of a pit crew at a Formula One race there. I mean, the left front wheel fitter knows exactly what to do. They practice it 100 times over so that they can do it within a split second. That is a complicated kind of problem. Futures problems, or the kind of issues that lend themselves to futures thinking, to scenario planning, are those really complex things where even the problem or the issue, even to try and describe it, is already really hard and case specific. And the relationship between key factors and driving forces, that's where the secrets are lying. And most of the time in these instances, you can influence it, you can't fix it. And that is where and why scenario planning is really a cool tool, because there you can imagine different ways or different approaches and try to imagine what the knock on the second and third order consequences of those new plans could be. Right. So futures problems are typically not aptly defined, precisely structured, not directly measurable, not noted by probability distributions. In other words, it's a mess. And in that mess is where future studies or scenarios is shining a little bit of light, helping people to understand a little bit better, to do a little bit of mental rehearsal of how this complex thing could evolve going forward. So most of these issues are complex and interactive, they're embedded in a problematic, and we can't just fix it. And therefore, the scenario thinking type of approach is usually better. When we create scenarios, we have different vantage points that we can use. We can either decide to think in an explorative manner. In other words, we try to understand how did we get here from however long we have data or information available. We try to go back as far as possible, trying to understand how did we get here? And then we create what we call a thick present. We really try to understand what is going on. What are all those key forces influencing this issue that we are trying to investigate? And then, much like an explorer with a torch, we look toward the future and say, okay, so how could this play out? How could this evolve going forward? And that is the vantage point from an explorative vantage point. We could also jump to an imagined time or end state somewhere in the future, 20 years from now, 40 years from now, and say, okay, now we are living, say for instance, we are living in Stellenbosch and in Cape Town and in the Western Cape in a plastic packaging free society. It is 2040. And then we look back to 2021 and say, so how did we end up here? How did we end up in 2040 in a plastic packaging free society? What were the big decision points? Who did what? What happened to make us end here? For this approach, we also understand the historical trend, and we also do the deep present, but then we jump to an imagined time in the future and we describe the end state, and then we look back to the present and say, okay, so how did we cover the ground between then and now? What were the big decisions that were made? Who were involved? What did they do? Right. So scenarios, what is it? How can we use it? We have said a few things, and just now in the chat, when you participated, you actually created a mini scenario of what people would eat in 2040. All right, so scenarios could be very technical, but it could also be quite intuitive. And depending on what it is you want to do, who's involved, how much time you have, you choose for different kinds of scenarios. Scenario is a story. A scenario is a description of journeys to multiple possible futures. What we try to write in there is our assumptions about those current trends. Now, what do we think? How will this play out? And why do we think so? We also make assumptions about critical uncertainties, those big things that would influence this issue. And then maybe a few new factors that could come into play and make this whole thing go different. So scenarios are stories, and more we see with all the available technologies and expertise available, that scenarios are becoming really cool things where people have enough budget. They create movies, they create cool videos, they create beautiful stories about what different futures could look like. So they come in very many shapes and forms. Like I said now, it could just be a narrative, it could be a story. It could also be a graph with different modeled or quantitative outcomes. It could also be, like the picture you see there, that was the Montfleur scenarios way long ago. I'm going to do a little bit more of that just now when we talk about the examples. So 5 notes. Many times when you say the word scenario, people immediately, the picture in their head is this 2x2 with critical uncertainties. Yes, many scenarios, we work with the key factors until we have 2 pivotal uncertainties that create 4 scenarios. But scenarios doesn't just have to be a 2x2. Like I showed you on the previous slide, it could just be a narrative, it could be a story, it could also be a graph with different things. So scenarios can be very many things. It does not have to be just a 2x2, but many scenario methods work towards creating 2 pivotal uncertainties, but it doesn't have to be a 2x2. And then we must be honest about what's going on in our minds when we think about the longer future. We already, in our minds, carry very strong images of dystopian futures. And our friends in Hollywood is helping us to have very vivid images of dystopian futures. And in scenario thinking, it is important to create really bad scenarios of how the future can work out really bad. But it's also very important to think of potential positive scenarios, how it could also work out in a good way. And for that, sometimes we have to do serious brain thinking, because we don't have these stored images, memories of the future that is very good. Because, well, there's probably not a lot of money or enough special effects budget or something to create good scenarios and make that into blockbuster movies that make our minds store the images. So we have to sort of actively, when we do scenario thinking, actively work on creating those potential positive images in our minds as we carry on. So lying beneath this is this notion that because we are co-creators of our futures, is that we can design a preferred future. And many times that should be the actual aim of creating scenarios, to create awareness of multiple plausible futures, but also to help decision makers see how they can design a preferred future, a future that people want to live in and want to be around. And the scenarios should help decision makers to see that, how they can do what they should be doing, what kind of policies to create, what kind of decisions to make, where to allocate resources or where to take resources away, so that we can actually create that preferred future. Right, so a definition: scenario is a story, a sequence of events that unfold over time and that are coherent, internally consistent and plausible. So the scenario set, if you create multiple scenarios, they should sort of hang together so that you can, and decision makers, the users of the scenario, must be able to look at the different scenarios and understand what the difference between them is in terms of making decisions, creating processes, assigning resources. The most important test is the plausibility one. Users of the scenario must be able to read it and think, that can actually happen, because otherwise they will not engage with the scenario story. And remember, what we want them to do is to read the scenario and then act. We want them to make decisions, and preferably better decisions, about creating a preferred future. And if that scenario set is not plausible, if they can't see it, if you don't write it in a manner that they can believe and say, oh, that can actually happen, they're just not going to engage, and all the effort would have come to nothing. So scenario work, behind all of this lies this willingness to learn. In other words, we create the scenarios not just to write cool stories or anything like that, but to create an opportunity to learn from those plausible futures. And it helps leaders, decision makers to spend that mental rehearsal time, to sensitize stakeholders, to say, oh, if you carry on doing what you're doing now, this is where you could end up. Or, hey, if you carry on doing what you have started doing, look at what a beautiful thing could happen. So not just the warning, doom and gloom kind of stuff, but also towards the positive things. It helps us to learn, to gather rich insights, and to create those new memories of the future. Because if we have those vivid images in our mind, we can start making decisions, assigning resources, creating processes. So the goals, when we create scenarios, we want to enrich understanding. We want to understand how in a complex and adaptive environment, those forces influence each other towards over the time period that we are imagining, 10 years, 20 years, what could happen, what is going on. Preferably, we want to use those scenarios to stimulate fresh and insightful dialogue. Make people talk about it, because if they talk about it, they are thinking about it and they will start doing something. We want to create a good and expanded basis for decision making so that people actually have something to say, oh, but this is why we are doing this now, because we can see that in 10 or 20 years, if we don't do this, this is where we could end up, or this is where we could end up in a positive manner. And the scenario process tries to sweep in multiple perspectives, and usually it adds new voices to a dialogue. The most important one is to rehearse that multiple futures so that we can feel what it feels like in those different futures, and then learn a little bit from it so that we can act. In South Africa, you can't really say the word scenarios without at least thinking about Clem Santa. Clem Santa is probably in South Africa the person that made scenarios known. People know about it. And even now, he's still writing his Futures of South Africa kind of scenarios. Whenever you hear the word game boards or flags, you know that the people that are talking or working is using Clem Santa's kind of approach for creating scenarios. And he's still writing actively. He has on his website these game boards for organizations and for the country. And what he then does is to describe the different outcomes and identify flags, in other words, indicators that would show that you are more there or more there wherever you are. In our country, in 1991 around, that was for those of you that are old enough, just before the first democratic election, the Montefiore scenarios was drawn up for the next 10 years in terms of how governance could happen. I'm showing you this for one reason, because many times people look at old scenarios and the first thing that they ask themselves is, okay, so were they right? And if we look back towards the definitions that I've shared with you just now, that is a totally unfair question to ask of any set of scenarios, because remember, they're not trying to be right. They are trying to influence the decision makers of the time, to give them insight so that they could make better decisions. So the fair question to ask of this set of scenarios was, did it help the decision makers of 1991 and 92 to imagine different futures and to make better decisions at their time? That would be the fair question to ask. For those of you that don't know the scenarios, they are still active. You can go Google and see video clips of the participants and anything like that. Quite an interesting activity. So what they did was create 4 scenarios based on big decisions. So the first big decision is a settlement negotiated? If the answer is no, we go to the ostrich scenario, where people are just burying their heads in the sand and they hope that this whole thing is going to go away. But if a settlement is negotiated, the next big thing is the transition rapid and decisive? If it is not, we go to the lame duck scenario that looks like it can fly, but it just can't get up. All right, that was the second scenario. If the transition is rapid and decisive, in other words, the yes road, then the next big question is, are the government policies that are designed, are they sustainable? If it is no, then we go to the Icarus scenario, fly for a while, wings melt, fall back. If it is yes, then we go to the flight of the flamingo. That takes a bit to start flying, but once it is flying, it is elegant and beautiful. So nice set of scenarios from quite a few years ago. A more recent example, 2019, NEDLAC asked the Institute for Futures Research to think about the futures of work in the South African context. And we used that approach where we work towards 2 key factors, and we created 4 scenarios there for futures of work in the South African context, specifically looking at skills. And then for the country as a whole, the Indlulamiti scenarios is used in a lot of government planning at the moment. When you attend these meetings, you hear them talking about it. And that is a nice website as well, where they have created multiple different scenarios. So a few recent South African examples. Different techniques. One summary of the different kinds of techniques to create scenarios is this one by the German Development Institute. I share this one because it comes from a free document, so you don't have to buy anything to get it. Quite a good source to use with really solid scenario things in there. I will share the link to it right at the end. All right, so the first group is like trend-based techniques where they do a lot of extrapolation and therefore usually mostly quantitative things where they look at a current trend and make different assumptions about how this can play out. The one I have there for you is the world population, and what is interesting here, the different scenarios is based on the number of children that women of childbearing age will choose to have. So the black line is the actual population growth from 1950 up until recently. And then the red line in the middle is if all women of childbearing age across the world continue to have children at the current fertility rate, then population growth is the red one in the middle. And the 2 blue dotted lines at the top and the bottom is if all women of childbearing age at the moment decide to either have half a child more, statistical number, or half a child less, then that is what could happen to population growth projected towards 2100. And that is an example of scenarios because there are different assumptions and different things in there. Basic assumption for this kind of scenarios is that the most appropriate way to show future developments is extrapolating existing developments. And the main critique against that is that we assume in that the future is a prolongation of the past. In other words, the way things happened is the way things will continue to happen. It's usually in rich scenario work a good point of departure. It's nice to create a reference or a business as usual scenario. And mostly if it is something like demographics that take a really long time to adapt, that is quite a useful. The next kind of technique is the systematic formalized way of doing. And what we do there is to identify the scenario field and then identify the key factors that would influence that field over the period of time, 10 years, 20, 30, whatever the time horizon is that you have set for the scenarios. What are those factors that would influence that issue over that time? And then you start working with the factors. You do impact analyses, you do systems analyses, all kinds of analyses with those key factors so that you understand, especially the mutual interrelationships between the factors, so that you understand how the system could evolve over time. And the German Development Institute created this 5-phase, and this type of scenario generation works really well. So the first thing you do is to have a very clear identification of the scenario field. And in practice at the Institute, what we have found is that phase 1 and 2, we actually sort of repeat them again. So we do an initial field identification. We start with the initial research, identifying the key factors. And in that process, we usually realize that, you know what? We may just have to do a little bit of a redefinition of the scenario field, and then we go into the real factor identification. So from practice, we've learned to sort of do that twice, just to make sure that we have the exact scenario field that we should be focusing on. Because many times when a client comes to us and asks us to do scenario work, they mostly come with a symptom or where their pain is or where they think the future pain could be. And the minute we start exploring and investigating, we realize, that the real pain is actually here. And then we sort of just do a recalibration of the scenario field and then do the real key factor identification and the rest. So like I explained just now, after the key factor identification, you do this key factor analysis, and there's all kinds of really cool thinking tools to help to get to know those key factors better, because the key factors are like, for instance, like when you're writing a play or a book, they're the characters in the story, and the way they act is what is going to make the story play out in different ways. And so not all key factors were created equal. Some are the main players. They are the lead actors in the story, and others are just extras. They're just filling in that kind of. So that key factor analysis is where we really get to know the factors, so that we know which of those factors are going to play the leading roles, which are the supporting actors, and which are just the extras, or maybe just the tree or the stream somewhere in the background. And knowing those factors really, really well helps us to create the different scenario stories, multiple different stories, so that people could learn from those different stories. And then the very, very important phase is to decide how to share the scenarios. Will it be printed? Are we going to present it? How will people engage with it? And sometimes, it is even important to sort of share the big scenarios in different versions to people. To the finance people, there will be way more numbers in there. To the marketing people, for instance, way more pictures, that kind of thing, of where will we go, what will we do next, to sort of translate the scenarios into different languages for different stakeholder groups as well. Here again, our NetLag work most recently, where we followed this same approach of identifying key factors, working the key factors until we got to pivotal uncertainties, and then wrote the rest of the factors into the stories. The last type of or bundle of scenario techniques is the more creative, narrative kind of scenarios, where you use intuitive logic. In other words, you put the right people in the room. Here in the in all of the scenario methods, it's really important to have the right people thinking together, but here even more so, because what you are relying on here are the implicit knowledge of the people that are thinking together, their knowledge of how to go about what to do. If you see a page number at the right bottom there, that comes from the GDI document, the German Development Institute document. So if you want to see where they describe this, those page numbers refer to the GDI document. So what we do here is to implement and use all kinds of creative techniques with people, to have them, well, in the olden days, pre-COVID, it would be physically in a room. Now it's physically in a Zoom room, to have people think together based on what they know about the scenario field. And for this reason, it is even more important to make sure that you have multiple voices thinking together, people that represent the different kinds of stakeholders that will be touched by this issue that you are thinking about, and that they are, on the one hand, able to think together, but that they also have what is needed in terms of that implicit knowledge that they can put into the thinking process. So in its most intuitive variant, it's sort of a quasi-literary text, a little story. Just now, when you participated in the what will we be having for breakfast, it was this kind of thing where we ask you to just think about a time in the future. We draw on your intuitive knowledge, in other words, what you like eating now, what you think the world is going toward. And I'm sure if you know your colleagues and you look at what they wrote down there in the chat in terms of what we will be having for breakfast going on, we will see if there was somebody from agricultural economics. Their answer may be different from the people that come from another department, for instance, because the people from agricultural economics think about, oh goodness, what are we cultivating? What could be possible 20 years from now? Or people that are more in terms of sustainability. What will we be doing? What will we do? So we see all kinds of that kind of input going into that answers, all right? But more complex, we also have all kinds of interesting thinking tools to guide people through this process. One was developed by the Stanford Research Institute. They call it intuitive logics, where we also identify factors and then sort them according to their potential influence on the scenario field. And then we also identify the roles that those factors would play, and we can start creating narratives and stories going on. So when we create scenarios, or when we decide to maybe use scenarios, when we think about a potential issue, there are 4 big decisions to be made. The first one is, okay, so are scenarios suitable? And then decision number 2, our vantage point. Are we going to think in a normative or explorative manner? And then are we going to work more qualitative or more quantitative, or in what combination of that? And then the technique that we are going to use. 4 big decision points. So the first one, if we just need to determine a course of action, then something like decision analysis or road mapping may be more appropriate. If we just want to keep track of changes, we just want to know how stuff is doing, we don't really want to think, we just want to track changes, then environmental scanning, monitoring, evaluation, that kind of stuff is more appropriate. But if we want to portray multiple alternative futures, then scenarios is what we want. Second decision point, are we going to think in a more explorative manner? In other words, identify how did we get here, identify what is going on, and then think in an explorative manner, how and what could happen going forward. For some issues and problems, it's actually better to think in this normative manner, where you just put people in an end state. Example of that is when you feel that people are sort of stuck in where they are and the current beliefs, the current assumptions about an industry, about a way of being, if it's entrenched in how people are living and doing and making decisions, then sometimes it helps to just put them in a perceived end state and say, okay, now that is where you ended up 20 years from now. How did you get there? What happened? Who did what? And then sometimes that sort of opens up the discussion, because now you explain to people where they are, and they must say, well, how did I get here? What happened? Or how did we as an industry, as an organization or an institution, how did we end up here in the end? And both of the approaches work equally well, depending on what it is, and create interesting discussions. The next decision, more qualitative, more quantitative. Not that very many years ago, there was a little bit scenarios with stories and models created extrapolations kind of thing. But as people realized, you know what, the stories are really nice, but we need a bit of numbers. And the numbers, people say, yeah, well, our models are nice, but you also can't model everything. We need a little bit more. Scenarios is putting into that position where they pull in from both and are able to use both to create a much richer product that the decision makers and the stakeholders have much better use for in terms of learning from the scenarios and be able to make better decisions going forward. And then, of course, which technique is going to work and how you choose the technique, the comfort levels of the scenario team, what they are comfortable with is very important. The time that you have, because some of these just take that much longer to do it really well. So how much time you have is an influence, and then who's going to be involved and their exposure to futures thinking, to scenario planning, a little bit of that. And then, of course, the issue itself may lend itself better towards one or the other. So when you're done, how would we know that we did good work? Because out there, many people stand up on stages with nice smoke and presentations, and they say, this is what the world's going to look like. In future studies, we also sometimes say, those are the pop futurists, the people that just make big claims about how the world, and then if you ask the second question, they're not able to answer. Then there's nothing behind the purple smoke. They didn't actually do research. So for me, I want to hear and I want to see the evidence that that person, whenever they can do the big stages and the purple smoke, but I just want something behind it. I want good, solid research behind that. So how to identify good futures work? It considers and presents multiple plausible futures. If people say, this is the one, the one future, this is going to happen, and especially if they use will and that kind of words, we prefer sounding a little bit less sure, because we can't be sure. So we use could or can rather than will or shall, that kind of stuff. And so multiple futures, it helps people to prepare. So if you can listen, if you can hear that the person wants people that are using the information to be more prepared, to make better decisions, then there's probably something good behind it. If it's more concerned with being prepared than with being right about the one future, then it has a better chance of being good futures work. And then in terms of success, we measure the success if we can help stakeholders and decision makers to not be surprised, to make better decisions. Then we say, yes, we think that we have done good work. 3 good sources, like I explained in the beginning. There's if you are able to get that book, it is written really well. It comes from the Oxford School. Rafael Ramirez and Angela Wilkinson has facilitated numerous big scenario sessions. And what is useful from them is that they talk about scenario learning. So whenever they speak, they say scenario learning, and they speak about scenario learning process, not planning or anything like that. Right. So the book is not lying around in stores, but Oxford OUP, if you contact them, they are more than willing to make it available, to deliver it to your house and whatever. So I got mine that way. Order it from them, and there you go. And then there is a nice article that Rafael Ramirez and some of his other colleagues wrote that I found quite interesting, and I always have a giggle when I read it. The title of the article is "Scenarios as a Scholarly Methodology to Produce Interesting Research." And what they are going around is that in big management journals, they said, oh, management research is getting a little bit boring because we're using the same things and we're just sort of measuring and we're making these little incremental kind of things. And that they reckon that scenarios could help people to actually produce more interesting research. So I like that. There's a link for you to that one. And then the German Development Institute's document that I referred throughout. It is free to access. There's the link for you. And what they do is to give a really broad overview of thinking about the future, about scenario analysis in general, and they do this breakdown of different scenario techniques, how to use different techniques in different settings for different issues, etc. So quite a nice document to have, and it's free to download and to share. In closing, about the producing interesting research, and these are direct quotes from the Ramirez article. They say scenarios could help to challenge existing assumptions, and we feel that in our work at the Institute for Futures Research every time on every project. You see people and they say, wow, we never thought about it like this. Now we're going to approach this in a different manner. That kind of challenging existing assumptions of what is possible, because the minute you start working across these longer timelines, and especially with the more positive kind of scenarios, you see how people sort of sit on their chairs in a different manner and say, you know what, we can actually do something. We can actually help co-create a better future. So challenging existing assumptions, especially negative or hopeless ones, to identify novel lines of inquiry. It opens up new research opportunities, because now people say, oh, we haven't explored this avenue before. We now need to assign resources here. We now have to do research. We need to know more. So it just opens up new opportunities, which is always for me very exciting to see people's eyes lighting up and say, oh, there's a new thing, we can do something. And what it does is to help engaged scholars to make sense of and address complex and uncertain contexts and produce interesting findings, says Ramirez. So from me, we're still at 10 to 1, so this is going to give us nice time to discuss with each other. You're welcome to ask questions. There's my email address in case you need anything else more. But thank you for listening, and now let us start talking.
Excellent, thank you, Doris. You know, I've always enjoyed listening to you. You're definitely one of our more engaging presenters. Present company excluded, whoever's in the meeting. But thank you for the energy and for the time that you've put into this. So I've been listening to you, and I hope this is an okay question to ask, but you've done a lot of work with industry in addition to your research. And I would love to hear an example of where you use scenario planning to assist a company or maybe in a research project, maybe something that isn't embargoed or private, or is there anything you can share with us?
Yes. A while ago, we did a nice one for the Retail Association of South Africa. So the Retail Association is all the people that sell anything in retail format, mostly the clothing, supermarkets, and their focus was, okay, we see, so it wasn't just the futures of retail, it was, okay, so what are the next skills we need to start developing in our retail people because of all the changes? So it was sort of two things. So where's retail going? And then in each of those, where is retail going? What kind of skills would our people need next? So what should we focus on? So there was also a lot of involvement from the retail SETA in terms of what they would put on their list of what kind of training would they pay for. So they were very engaged in all of this as well. And that was quite an exciting project to work on. Obviously, right in the beginning, we first had to sign lots of agreements between the big retailers so that none of whatever we were doing could be seen as collusion, because in their world, collusion is a big thing. So that was, in terms of managing the project, that was an important thing to keep in mind all the time, so that we don't step toward that kind of thing, that anything that we were doing there could be seen as potential collusion in any way, but that it was for the betterment of the whole industry and maybe beyond that as well. So we did multiple focus areas. How is technology going to evolve? What is happening in the world of people? What is happening in the world of stores, kind of thing, to create different ways or different versions of what retail could look like. And then in each of those stories, what are the kinds of skills that people would need in those different retail environments? Interesting things came about, and it was done quite a few years ago, so that even now we still using that research. Or the retailers, we had a presentation a short while ago with one of the retailers that were involved in that research that took place about 4 years ago, way before COVID lockdown or anything like that happened. And many of the outcomes of the things that we've identified there just caught a lot of speed, and they were saying, you know what, luckily we started repositioning and doing things, and we could actually benefit from what we've learned from that. So for us as the people that led the research, it felt, oh yeah, they learned something, they did something, and now they're benefiting from it. So it was this full circle kind of thing. As a, oh yeah, it worked.
Good, and it's lovely to hear. Oh, I'm on. And it's lovely to hear that the project had a bit of longevity, that you could even years later continue having the conversation on that one research project. So just a quick question, if I may, and please, colleagues, add your questions to the chat. Heilet will also help to I'm going to hand over to you in a second. Brighton Shunga asked, so the systems thinking approach, it can be widely applied in any other area and discipline. Do you see futures research, futures thinking as much as the same?
The glasses that we wear is systems glasses and complexity glasses. So we try the same things that people from systems theory use, you know, what are those things? How are they connected? How could they evolve? What could change? So I don't think you can really practice futures thinking without at least a really strong systems lens, wearing the systems lens, yes.
Good. So Heilet, will you, we're going to start now in the chat with Nima Roberts' question. I just scrolled past it. Is one scenario better than another? And then how can you tell, especially for decision makers?
We try, or the methods that I prefer, create equally plausible scenarios. Obviously, different ones will be more preferable than other. But the method that we use and that I prefer in terms of academic rigor create equally plausible scenarios. And for me, it feels more responsible to create scenarios in that manner, because because the whole purpose is for decision makers to be able to learn from the scenario and the different decisions, the different paths that decision makers in the scenarios took created different outcomes, and that is the richness. Otherwise, if you create just one and the others you don't really pay a lot of attention to, you're already skewing the whole process. And I don't think as academics that is responsible kind of research.
Absolutely. I'm going to hand over to Heilet now, your colleague.
Yeah, and Doris, also to add to that, there's always more than one future, and we never know which future is going to play out. So the more prepared you are in thinking about multiple scenarios, the better you are prepared for whatever happens. So that's always for me a good guideline. So
and
I
even
see that
if we can't see it now, I mean, many of the, especially if we work on a little bit longer timelines, even if we can't see something really happening now, it helps to sometimes throw in one or two crazy scenarios. I like quoting Jim Dator. He's a futurist in Hawaii, and he says any good thoughts about the future must be at least a little bit ridiculous, because what we try to do is to expand the horizons, to make people think of other things. So in every scenario, there must be at least a little bit of spice in there.
And Doris, I think the one that jumps out at me these days is the whole thinking that New Zealand did around their lockdown of supply chains, which at the time was very ridiculous, to quote Jim Dator, because why would that happen? We are a global world, people are connected, everything happens. And then, funny enough, COVID happened. And for New Zealand specifically, that did mean the lockdown potentially of supply chains. Maybe you can just share a bit more about that, because I think that will also illustrate the whole multiple futures, thinking about something that could be ridiculous, but then in the end could happen, and they were prepared.
Yes, for sure. Now, I love this story. A while ago, actually last year in lockdown, we had this international futurists speaking to each other. And this one person says he's involved in the government in New Zealand. And a number of years ago, they were all drafted into a scenario planning activity. And at the time, and I'm quoting what he said, at the time, he looked at his diary and said, I have such a lot of other stuff that I need to do. Now I have to go and imagine stuff that can't even happen. And he was quite annoyed with it, because the whole scenario thing was what could happen and what should the government then do? What are the things if something happens and New Zealand's supply chains are cut off? In other words, they are isolated as an island. What could happen? What could they do inside? And his word says he was quite annoyed, because how could that ever happen? But they did the exercise and there was a big report written, and he said, well, at the time the report got filed somewhere and everybody was finished and they went along their ways and they did their stuff. But then when COVID started happening and international lockdowns, people said, remember that thing that we did? Where's that thing? And they had to do a little bit of finding, but the thinking was done. The planning was done, and they really found themselves leaps and bounds ahead of many other countries that were scrambling and thinking, okay, so what do we do now? What do we do next, kind of thing. So where the beauty of the story was, at the time when it took place, the people that were involved in it, they participated and they created beautiful output, but they thought it was a waste of time. But then when it actually happened, they enjoyed the benefit of it.
Exactly. So I always like that story as well, because it's so very relevant. So Doris, Liz Maruti, if I say your name incorrectly, please, I apologize. wants to know about the challenge of capacity of using scenarios in Africa beyond South Africa. What are some of the opportunities for training? And what is your sense around futures thinking in Africa and, you know, scenarios then specifically?
I think Africa lends itself ideally. We have such a strong history of oral stories and lessons where people tell each other stories to help them to understand what is going on. So I think there's a natural synergy and a natural kind of, if we create stories that people can relate to in Africa, I think scenarios can go a long way. And to teach people how to do scenarios, the hard science, and this is what you do, is always possible. And I think an academic institution like ours is well positioned to teach that across departments, across faculties, to help people to imagine, because no matter in what faculty you are, your kind of area has multiple futures, and to help people to use scenario planning in the research that they are doing at the moment, in what they plan to do going forward. So yes, I think we are well positioned in Africa, because telling each other stories that we learn from is not a foreign thing for us. That is what we do across cultures in Africa. And if we just put the good science behind it, I think there is definitely good futures for futures in Africa.
And Doris, to add to that, Brighton Chunga, who asked the previous question, also then says that he assumes there would be lots of data involved. He is in the environment and water field, but I want to add to that and just check if you think I'm right. Is scenarios isn't necessarily data heavy. You can also look at it from a different perspective. And I think that's where the different scenario techniques makes it quite useful, because you can have the very intense, long-term 6-month period of analyzing and taking the key factors and really churning through the information and coming up with 4 scenarios. Or you can do what we might refer to as a quick and dirty scenario, which also helps you to think about the future and consider what those would be and making decisions based on that.
Yes, I come from a strong quantitative background, so I always want to throw in at least a little bit of data into the scenarios. But the best scenarios have a nice balance of quantitative data and of all the other things, because in complex adaptive systems, we can only measure what we can measure. And there are very many other things that we can't measure, and that is just there. So to find a combination of data and of all the other things, and especially in water, I mean, water is one of the most contested issues in Africa and the world. So if that person is doing research on water, I'll be cheering you on all the way. I think it should be much higher on decision-making agendas than what it is at the moment. If people ask me whether I lie awake at night because of the energy crisis in South Africa, then I say, no, I lie awake because of water, because we can make electricity, but we can't make water yet. So whoever that person is doing research on water, please carry on.
Doris, and I think Brighton's concern is also that there might not be data available. So how would that then influence scenarios, especially in the developing countries?
Yeah, especially where we have a no data issue. That is usually one of the big things that the scenario shows, and that make decision makers realize, hey, we better assign resources to start measuring certain things. So if there is very little or no data available, many times that sort of normative technique, vantage point, where we put ourselves in some or another different end states and look back, then you can actually write the no data issue as a key factor into the scenarios. Because if it is important to measure so that we know where we're going on, then that gets portrayed in the scenarios, and decision makers and the holders of the budget then realize, oh goodness, if we want to know or we want to steer something in a certain manner, we had better start collecting the data. And that sometimes the scenario exercise sort of validates the kind of budget allocations that follow from that.
So the scenario exercise isn't dependent on the data, but it can actually influence better data. So that I always like that thinking as well. Then Rihanna Kutsia wants to know around research, and the impact has become very important. Research impact has become a very important criterion for funders. So many researchers find it difficult to describe the short-term or the long-term future of their impact of their research. So can we see a link between scenarios and the support from futures research in this regard?
Yes, definitely, for sure. And I am sensitive to where, because people want to validate, and they must be able to validate everything in their research. And then you have scenarios, which is imaginary. And that is sort of, in some academic terms, it is sort of a little bit of a contradiction. So where to place scenarios in a more traditional kind of research, where you're not using a futures thinking approach, where, yes, that is what we do kind of thing, in a more traditional kind of research to say, where do we go? What do we do? I think scenarios is a nice add-on so that you adhere to your area's academic tick boxes of this is what you do, but then add a little bit of scenario thinking. You know, the last chapter where you say, okay, we think in future, you know, this could be this, that, or the other. There could be a little bit of scenario add-on, or it could be just be the spin-off, because in your research, you probably did very solid research. Remember my slides on understanding how we got here and understanding what is going on. You probably did very solid research there, and then sort of do an add-on with the scenarios, it's your next research or that kind of thing, so that you don't, because I know that in that very strict, okay, you have to adhere to all of these things, scenarios might be a little bit fuzzy to fit into that process snugly. Although for me, in my perfect world, it just fits.
Absolutely. And then Doris Fenji asks a very good question, referring to the plausibility. If plausibility is the test of a good scenario, what would then be regarded as an unrealistic time projection? Is there such a thing in scenario planning?
The realistic or unrealistic time has a lot to do with the issue. Some technology kinds of things have shorter timelines just because tech changes so quickly. If we do a demography kind of scenario and we take only a 5-year or a 10-year view, it's too short for demography, because you're not going to see a lot of changes and things. So if you have a demography kind of issue, you need to work over at least 2 generations kind of thing. Whereas with technologies, AI, that kind of stuff, if you try to imagine what AI would be like 100 years from now, it might be very, very fuzzy. And for that, for instance, you need a shorter timeline. So depending on your focus area, the issue that you are thinking about, that's going to have a huge influence on what is a realistic or less realistic timeline.
And then Doris Quanele wants to know, and it's quite an interesting question, a situation of complex scenarios, especially for decision and policy makers, and I'm reading the question, where action needs to be taken, which involves resource allocation. How careful should one be when creating scenarios to avoid misallocation of resources on a future scenario that may or may not occur?
We are actually busy on quite a few projects like that, for me personally, you have put your finger on my responsibility pane, because I feel that as the lead researcher on those projects, I feel that responsibility very, very strongly, that, you know what, people are going to act on these scenarios. I had better put in the stuff as a responsible manner as what I could. So all the research, all the key factors, I try to put in as much responsibility as possible. And then we present the multiple scenarios, and then people choose their preferred scenario that they want to work toward. So, and in the preferred scenario, it might not even be one of the ones, it could be a combination of parts of the ones that we maybe have presented. They create their preferred outcomes and then budget and resource accordingly. And then in a responsible process, we usually suggest, and we see the clients doing that, to revisit the plan regularly to see what has changed. Because at the time of choosing or deciding or creating your preferred scenario, starting to assign resources, creating your pathway towards that, just because we have made the decision or created the master plan doesn't say that that is going to happen. It is what we hope to achieve. It is what we see happening. And then it would be totally unresponsible of the decision makers to not revisit that 2 or 3 years down the line and come back and say, okay, 2 or 3 years down the line, we created these scenarios. Are they still valid? Is it still working? What is changing? And what are we doing to adapt to those changing? So scenarios should never be a once-off and, okay, it was a 40-year scenario and now we will only come back 40 years from now. For a 40-year scenario, 4 years from now, we have to come back and say, oh, okay, what is changing? Should we create new scenarios, or are we still on our way? So that regular checking back is the responsible thing to do.
Yeah, Doris, and what I like is scenario thinking allows you to create a snapshot in time for a period of time, but then it's evolving because everything changes. We know that change is one of the only constants. So it will be irresponsible to actually take it forward. So I think I've scanned through the chat and seen most of the questions. I don't know if anybody is brave enough to put a hand up and maybe voice your question if you have a final burning question for Doris. But you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, maybe people have used scenarios in their own environments and want to make a contribution.
So I see Richard Newman. You're welcome to unmute or put your video on if you want to, or just unmute and ask your question or comment. You just need to unmute, sorry.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm working on the Institutional Transformation Committee at Stellenbosch University. And the question I posed was whether you think futures thinking can be applied also in this context, because, you know, it's a very complex situation. And do you have any comments on the application of futures thinking to transformation at Stellenbosch University?
Oh, yes, for sure. And we love complex. Like I said, for the more messy, the more comfortable we start feeling. But yes, yeah. We are frequently pulled into sessions where industries or industry bodies realize that, whoa, stuff is changing. We need to change as an industry body or as a big player within an industry. So yes, I think so. And it would be lovely. We were involved here and there in short interventions about imagining the 2040 Stellenbosch University. We participated in creating a publication with the Museum of Heilet. What was that beautiful book called?
Yeah,
for the centenary.
Yeah, it was the Future for Higher Education, and we did it through the Stellenbosch Museum, the University Museum. And what we did there, which was quite interesting, is we actually sketched different scenarios and created different stories, but also asked artists to imagine and vision how they would see the future of higher education. And that was put in a publication around the future of higher education. So that's also another way of just letting people imagine and see what the future could look like, and what futures are out there.
Yeah, Richard, but the short answer is yes, we would love to be involved.
So Karina asked, what was the book? Karina, I don't have the exact title, but I know there were at one stage a lot of these books available at the museum.
Forward.
Yes, forward. There we go. Forward. And it was around the future of higher education, and it linked to the 100th or the centenary celebrations of the university 2 years ago. Mm. But also very interesting to see the artists. Artists often have very interesting perspectives around possible scenarios in the future. So if there's anybody else, we do still have a few minutes, as far as I can see, Corina, that would be brave enough or willing enough to put a hand up and ask a question. You're welcome to do so. Fenji, please ask your question. Fenji, if you can unmute as well, that's the one Zoom word, unmute, please.
Yeah, it was saying, there we go. Thank you so much. I'm joining in, I'm doing my research on food security and the future of food security in South Africa in terms of farming systems. And I'm just so intrigued and excited by this idea of scenario planning and futures thinking. I'm looking at it in the context of my research and seeing endless possibilities for how that could apply. I'm just interested in how engaging with other stakeholders and getting them on board in that futures thinking approach. You know, like I'm thinking about the farmers that I am working with and how I could engage with them in kind of imagining the future as they may see it, looking at current trends and how that would apply to the food systems in the future. So I'm just really grateful for the presentation. It's not really a question, but just like a comment. And I'm hoping that I will be able to apply that in my own research. So thank you very much.
Fenji, I'm going to invite you. We are busy with a big project at the moment on imagining the futures of work in agriculture. In other words, where will people work in agriculture going forward? But we're touching quite a bit on food and will we still produce and where and what. There might be parties of interest to you. And we are still having one or two, especially the scenario session is still going forward. So if you send us your email address, we are going to extend an invitation to you, and then maybe you can just see what it feels, what happens there.
Great. So Fenji, we hope you can join us. That will be fantastic. You'll see me and Doris again, but I'm sure that won't be a bad thing. So I see Neka Makonam, if I say your name correctly, you've switched your video on. Would you like to ask a question? If you do, you must just unmute.
No, I think.
Okay.
Okay, cool. I think
any
that's
further burning questions around scenarios? We really hope that you will start implementing these, even if it's just short and quick and dirty, or if you'd like to engage with us more around how it works and want to do it in a more structured scientific way, we can also share that. I think you've got both our email addresses there. So thank you for your time. I know it's lunchtime. I'm sure everybody wants to go and have their lunch. So Corina, over to you. Thank you for having us.
I just want to close with a heartfelt thank you for such an interesting session. And Heilet, thank you for also adding to the conversation. I suspect I have a future I might want to do, so something that I've been toying with for a while is the postgraduate diploma in future studies. And every year I promise myself that I'm going to enroll.
Just do it.
Thank you. So I think maybe now that I've listened to you, it's such a widely applicable approach, and it's so interesting. So maybe this year I will be a bit more serious And maybe if anybody in the webinar wants to join me and be my study buddy, you've got my email, I think. Good. So again, thank you. Much appreciated your time and your effort. And we hope you have a very, very good Wednesday afternoon. And then to the everybody that joined us, thank you for making the time. We will be sending out the YouTube link if you feel that you can share this presentation also with your colleagues or your students, your supervisors. Please feel free to do. And I'm sorry that, and Kema Kunam, that you couldn't join us live, but maybe, you know, always follow up with the email. You're welcome to email me and I will also forward it. So good with that. I wish you have a very lovely Wednesday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.